Hello and welcome back. My name is Dr. Christopher Gennari, and this is Great Big History Project Podcast. And in this episode, we do China, Part 2, 1989 to 2020. So we start in 1989. The dramatic, traumatic, revolutionary year of 1989. The Berlin Wall is going to fall. Eastern Europe is going to collapse. The Soviet Union's control and wealth implodes. What does it mean for China? Well, it means Tiananmen Square, otherwise known as the June 4th incident in 1989. Notice it's called the incident officially. Student-led protests for liberalization of politics. That starts in April. Now, why? Well, the situation was coming apart. Communism was failing. China was just like the Soviet Union was having its reforms. We talked about in our last episode the liberalization of the economics. People were making a little more money. Things were getting better, and they were saying, which is what's neoliberalism, the idea. Then the liberal project was that as people get richer, they want more freedom. They're going to want democracy. That freedom of economics, democracy follows the freedom of economics. That as people get richer, they'll demand more rights. That's basically how Europe worked. And so, or that's a project of Europe since the French Revolution. And it's arguable, but that was the idea in 1989. If you help people make money, you don't have to defeat the Soviet Union. You have to convince Russians that they want more money. And if they want more money, they're going to want more freedom because they're going to want to have a say in how in the government that will make the rules about how they make money. And so student protests start for liberalization of politics in April. And then there's the death of a reformer. And we see this in like Les Mis, right? The Les Miserables. We see this, the death of a reformer. Sets up, there's a problem, right? The guy who was supposed to lead the reforms, dies. And the conservatives can now be like, hey, we can put a stop to that. Plus, there's inspiration around the world. In early 1989, communist parties are collapsing. In April, Poland allows for multiple parties. By October, the Berlin Wall is going to allow East Berliners to go into West Berlin and come back. European communism is falling apart. It's breaking. On May 19th, 1.2 million people show up to join protesters. Same day, the Baltic states declared independence from the USSR. So I remember these days. I remember being like, wow, I am seeing something unreal. The world was changing before my eyes. Every day was something new. Hungarians were going across a fence into Austria, right? East Germans were moving into West Germany. Everything was happening. So 1.2 million people. You have to imagine, that's 1.2 million people in central Beijing. That's crazy. That fills the city. On June 1st, all live TV outside of China was cut off. Dun dun dun. On June 3rd, troops start entering Beijing and start accosting the civilians, pushing them around, beating them up. And on June 4th, they begin arresting and shooting people in Tiananmen Square. So somewhere between May 19th and June 1st, the conservatives decided enough was enough. That if they didn't put down these protests, if they didn't shoot these people, the Communist Party might collapse. June 5th, the events of June 5th does not officially exist in China. And yet, I think it's Charlie Cole, took a prize-winning photograph of the Tank Man on June 5th. Tank Man, the photograph does not officially exist. This is the picture by Jeff Widener of the AP of the man on his way home from work or the grocer standing in front of a bunch of tanks on their way into central Beijing, on their way to Tiananmen Square. He'll climb on the first tank to knock, to talk to people, to tell them to leave, or we don't actually know what he said, and someone will eventually whisk him away, and the tanks will continue going. In July, Gorbachev says that countries should find their own way to socialism. The USSR will not invade like they did in 56 and 68. So to the Communist Party in China, the Soviet Union has gone soft. In August, Eastern European refugees start streaming into the West. In November, the Berlin Wall is opened and then torn down. East Germany disappears in 1990. This causes a crisis in China. If the CCP stays in charge, it's going to have reforms. All of its allies have just disappeared. They've all imploded. Communism has imploded. The communist parties are gone. They've imploded. And so the answer would be socialist capitalism. A privatization of public businesses. So you get oligarchs, you get princes. In some ways, this is exactly what happens in the former Soviet Union. So there's a lot of corruption. Farmers produce for people and then they sell the extra. So they produce their quota and then everything they produce over that, they can sell for themselves or save. Foreign businesses can build factories. So there's an opening up of the economy, especially to American corporations. They provide cheap labor. They provide labor peace. There's no unions because the CCP is the union. So the CCP will negotiate the wages. You don't have to worry about any strikes. There are no strikes. And in exchange, you get to sell to the Chinese market, which in 1980, 88%. I mean, it's still 600 million people, but 88% lived in poverty. That meant they lived on less than $2 a day. So if you're entering the economy in 1985, you're looking for the you're looking for the cheap labor and the labor peace. But by 2015, less than 2% are living in severe poverty. That's Western numbers. Less than $2 a day. That's Western numbers. Severe poverty. Less than $2 a day. They go from 88% to 2%. So you have an entire generation of Chinese, and you can see that 88%. Look at what the Cultural Revolution did to China, right? So you have by 2015, you've got a market you can sell to. And that market has increased from 600 million people to 1.5 billion people. But, and there's the but, what does China get out of it? And this is where China's smart. And we're going to talk about this in the China as Superpower video that's coming in a couple of days. Foreign countries had to merge with a Chinese company. They couldn't just open a factory and run it themselves like these companies can do in most other countries. They actually had to allow they had to become partners with a Chinese company. And that Chinese company got access to their technology, to their IP, to their intellectual property, to their knowledge. And there's no copyright laws. So the Chinese companies are able to just copy and make their own versions of the same thing and then sell it. Here's the example I can give you of how copyright laws hurt foreign companies in China is fountain pens. I like fountain pens. I like grading with them. I like writing with them. Fountain pens, right? Mont Blancs. I don't have a Mont Blanc, but fountain pens. And if you go to Amazon, you will see Amazon is flooded with cheap Chinese-made, Chinese company fountain pens. But here's the thing. They all look exactly like bigger company, Western company fountain pens. They look like Lamais, Malamy, a German company. They look like Sailor pens. They look like Diplomats. But they're 1/10 the price. Now, they're more plastic than metal. But why? They're made in the exact same factory as the Western pens are made. Or they're made next door by the exact same company. They put their own stamp on it. Okay, they use cheaper materials. They might use cheaper labor, and they're less qualitative standards. But you're talking getting a $100 pen for $25. And it looks the same. It acts, more or less the same. It's a fountain pen. It's a 150-year-old technology. It's not that hard to make. And that's kind of my point, is with no copyright laws, and Amazon is flooded with these. Amazon, at some point over the last 5 years or so, opened itself up to Chinese manufacturers. And so you could see it with iPods. If you look up MP3 players, Amazon is flooded with old iPods that are not Apple iPods, but they look like Apple iPods that are now discontinued. Why do they look like Apple iPods? Because they're made in factories that used to make them iPods. The MP3 players. They look exactly the same. And you go, well, why doesn't Apple argue with that? Well, they want to have access to the Chinese market. So, hey, they're stealing our IP to sell discontinued versions of our old products. All right, it's not worth messing around for $1 billion market. And so what this allows is Chinese companies to catch up, to imitate. Remember, they don't have the universities to get better, so they need a generation where they're able to just produce these things. But now they have it. They have the technology. So the West is losing its advantage. The West is inventing the stuff, and China is just now able to, because they have access, they're producing it, they have the blueprints, so they can make it for themselves. And so Chinese companies begin to catch up, whereas they might have been 100 years behind in 1985. They're now, in many cases, on par with, or a generation behind, Western companies, Japanese companies. That's amazing. That's an amazing catch-up. That's exactly what Mao wanted to do with the Great Leap Forward, and it didn't involve murdering hundreds of millions of people to do it. I'm not saying nobody got hurt. The CCP is still the CCP. But socialist capitalism has been much more successful than Mao ever could have dreamed. And so the CCP still matters. And this is where they figured it out. They avoided Gorbachev's fate. They avoided the communist parties of East Europe's fate. They make some winners and they steal from others. They allow for corruption at the local level. There is corruption. There's definitely corruption. The artist Weiwei, WEI, points this out in his art all the time. That it's the local officials that build a school that has no concrete in it. So when an earthquake happens, the entire school falls on the kids. They got the money to build a real school with real steel and real concrete. Where'd all that money go? They built the school for 1/10 the price, but they charged the CCP the same amount. Where did that money go? That's corruption at the local level. But the CCP is able to maintain control. The CCP basically made a deal, which was, we run the government, we'll make the rules, and you'll make money. Don't F with us. That was the deal after Tiananmen Square. We are going to give you growth, but don't ask for democracy. And for people who remember the trauma of the 50s, of the 60s, of the 70s, and even of the 80s, okay, that's a decent deal, okay? So Chinese people get wealthier, but there's no political change. Which means Uyghurs, the Turkish peoples out in the West, get into concentration camps to make them into Chinese. Remember, they're Muslims. They're Turks. They got reabsorbed back in the 30s and the 40s. So they can never be Han. Right? As long as they're Uyghurs, they can never be Han. And so you now have to police them culturally. Because they might want to separate the far West. They might want to break up China. That's where political Islam comes in. From the Middle East to South Asia, like Buddhism or Islam, from the Middle East to South Asia to Western China. There's the war, quote unquote, against Taiwan. The two states are still at war. But what do you do with Taiwan? Taiwan is not allowed to be independent. Every time Taiwan says it's going to be independent, missiles fly over Taiwan to remind them, we can hit you. Every time Taiwan has an election, missiles fly over Taiwan. Every time America sells weapon systems to Taiwan, the ambassador gets yelled at. The idea is, yes, Taiwan and China are still China. There is one China, but they are a warring states, period. And the question is, who is going to absorb who? And when? And how? What about the Hong Kong system? Hong Kong got reabsorbed. The British gave it back, having taken it in the Opium Wars of 1830. They gave it back in 1997. But the idea was a democratic, Commonwealth, very Anglo culture had developed on Hong Kong. Open to trade, a crossroads between East and West. British in its culture. It had its own parliament. Like, what happens with that? And what we've seen in the last couple of years is violence. That anytime Hong Kong starts to talk about separation or independence or keeping its own way, its own system, that system is diametrically opposed to the CCP. It is a competition. And the CCP can have no competition. And so you get violence, protests are then met with more violence. And then you get rules and laws that say you can't protest or you can't do this or the parliament is no longer powerful. So there is a there is an attempt to suck Hong Kong in and homogenize it, just like the rest of China. We see this with people. The government gives a rating system to loyalty. Good citizens get bonuses. Their loans are lower. They get a credit rating from not a bank, but from the government. How good of a Chinese citizen are you? And you can imagine all the social problems that come in, right? What do you write in your comments on Twitter? Who did you vote for in the last elections? Where do you live? What jobs do you have? But also, what is your search history? What do you post on Weibo? Who are you married to? Who's your cousin? Did they go to university? What organizations do they belong to? What organizations do you belong to? What organizations do your kids belong to? All of that affects, because it's about control. And this is seen in the control of the internet, of what people will see, how people will interact. And even if it's relatively free, it's monitored. It's put into a database. And that's that credit rating. And so there's always this two systems going on, the political and the social. And they're in conflict, and sometimes open conflict, like in Hong Kong. But many times they're in a more grinding conflict. The CCP doesn't want to end up like the USSR. And yet Chinese people are getting wealthier. And so in our third lecture, we'll talk about what may happen with China. The good and the bad. Because China is clearly the second largest economy in the world. It is the largest population in the world, though that will decline and India will eventually become the largest population in the world as the older generation dies out and the one child policy generation gets old. But the world, East Asia, will have a powerful China again. A Tang level, Qing level, or it already does have a Tang level, Qing level China again. And so we'll have a lecture talking about what does that mean for East Asia. So, okay. Thank you. See you soon. Be safe.